Well, hey there, boys and girls. This week we are going to be reading Earthworms. This is a informational or nonfiction book written by Claire Llewellyn, and the pictures and drawings are by Barry Watts. But you know what's coming first. First, let's go over some vocabulary words that we need to know. Our first word coming up is soil. Soil is a noun, and it means the dirt that a plant grows in. Next, we have segment. Segment is a noun, and it means the body part of a worm, specifically one of many pieces that make up a worm. Now we have the word bristle. Bristle is a noun that means a short, hard hair that helps the worm stick to the dirt and move through it. Lastly, we have the word cocoon. Cocoon is a noun, and it means the hard shell where worm eggs grow. Something super cool about informational or nonfiction text is that they have some really cool parts inside of them, but they look kind of weird if you've never seen them before. So let's go over those really quickly. First, let's talk about the table of contents. The table of contents is going to be towards the beginning of the book, and it's going to tell you different pages where you can find, for instance, in this book, different topics about how a worm eats or moves or what its enemies are. Other table of contents might tell you where new chapters start in a chapter book. But regardless, a table of contents will tell you what pages you can find a new section or piece of the book. Next, we have the glossary. At the end of many nonfiction books, you'll see a glossary, and that's because a lot of times nonfiction books have words that maybe you've never seen before. If you haven't seen a word, you can look in the back of the book and look it up in the glossary. Sometimes you might hear this called the dictionary, but that's when the whole book by itself is nothing but words and what they mean. If it's just a page or two inside of a nonfiction book, we call it a glossary. And the glossary is going to tell you the definitions or what the words mean for those weird new words that you might not know. For instance, we just went over the word bristle, and at the very top of the glossary, you can see that bristle means a tiny, stiff hair. Up next, we have the index. The index is usually the last thing you will see in a nonfiction book. In the index, let's say you want to look up a very specific word or topic inside the book, but you don't want to flip through every single page to find it, do you? You can go to the index, and let's say we want to talk about the ooey gooey earthworms. Maybe we want to talk about slime. We can look at the index, and it's always in alphabetical or ABC order. Go all the way to the S's, and there, just under skin and sleeping, is the word slime. And you can see that slime could be found on pages 16, 18, and 19 for all your ooey gooey needs. Something else cool in this book and some other nonfiction or informational books is that you can get extra information that isn't written normally on the page like the rest of the words are. In this book, you have little blocks with wiggly sides, and they're colored in with fun different colors, and they give you extra information, usually about the pictures on the page or what you just read. But basically, it's going to tell you some more cool facts, and it's a great place to look if you can't find the answer to a question in the normal parts of the book. Similarly to extra information, we also have photograph information. This is usually what you can see in almost every nonfiction book that uses real photographs instead of drawings. What they want to do, and by they I mean the author, the photographer, the people who make the book, what they want to do is describe exactly what is happening in the picture. So on this page, it's kind of hard to see. Like, it looks like dirt. There's probably an earthworm in there because the whole book is titled Earthworms, right? But it is a little hard to tell. So, like you see circled in green right by the picture is smaller words that says a worm tunneling its way through the soil. So it tells you exactly what it is that you are looking at in the photograph. All right, guys, you know what time it is? It is time to read. Let's go. Earthworms. All sorts of worms. Dig up any patch of earth in a garden or park. Look closely and you will probably see a wriggly worm. Worms that live in the soil are called earthworms. There are several kinds of earthworms. Most earthworms are reddish brown and about as long as your hand. There are many different kinds of worms around the world. Worms come in many colors and sizes. Some are so tiny that they are hard to see. Others, such as the giant earthworm of Australia, are as long as a car. In the top right, we have a garden worm and a giant worm. This giant worm from Australia is as long as a car. It is much larger than a garden worm. And our extra information says the brandling worm, over here in this picture, has a stripy skin. This makes it easy to recognize. Finding earthworms. Earthworms live in damp soil where there are bits of dead plants to eat. Most of them live near the top of the soil. For this picture, our extra information says earthworms are easy to find. Dig in the garden with a spade or fork. You are sure to find some in the soil. Earthworms live in woods, meadows, and gardens. They live under lawns and among dead leaves under bushes and trees. Worms also love compost heaps, where people pile vegetable peelings and other food waste. In the yellow area, there are very few worms in sandy soil. This is because rainwater drains away quickly and the soil becomes too dry for them. A worm's body. A worm is a very simple animal. It has no skeleton, no lungs, no eyes, and no ears. Its body is a tube made of many tiny segments. Each segment is filled with liquid and has bristles that help the worm move. Worms can tell the difference between light and dark. If a worm is uncovered, it tries to get back in the dark. On the picture, we have the labels, the front of the worm, where the mouth is, each individual little parts that are called the segment, and the bristles that go around the segment. Then this longer part, it looks like a segment that's been stretched out, is called the saddle, and that is where a worm's eggs are made. And then at the other end, we have the back of the worm. Earthworms breathe through their skins. They take in air that is trapped in the soil. On wet days, worms' air pockets fill with water, and worms have to go up to the surface. If they didn't, they would drown underground. A worm's body is damp but not slimy. The front end is more pointed than the back. Feeding. Earthworms feed on the rotting parts of dead plants. They have no teeth or jaws, so the food they eat has to be very soft. Sometimes they nibble food with their tiny lips, but usually they suck it up. Worms also feed on soil. They use the good parts as the soil goes through their body. Then they get rid of waste in a worm cast. In the daytime, worms usually stay under the soil and feed on the roots of dead plants. At night, when it is dark and damp, they crawl up to the surface and search for dead leaves. They drag the leaves under the ground. A pile of dead leaves is a favorite feeding place for worms. Sometimes they store the leaves in their tunnels until they rot. This makes the soil healthy. Moving. Worms have strong muscles to help them move. There are ring-shaped muscles inside each segment. These make their body shrink or spread out. Other muscles run along their body and make it grow short or long. This picture information says a worm's damp body helps it move easily through the soil. And I like to think of a worm moving as a slinky. So you have a slinky that you can stretch out, but then it all comes back together and it's short again. Then you can stretch it out and it comes back together. And a worm moves in a similar way. It stretches and gets long, and then it catches up with itself. And then it stretches out to go through some more dirt, and then shrinks back up. A worm's bristles are very important in helping it move. The worm digs its bristles into the soil to anchor itself. In the first picture, outlined in blue, we have a worm moves by pointing its head in the direction it wants to go. It anchors the back of its body and the head end becomes thicker. In the second picture, outlined in yellow, we have the worm then stretches its body to push through the soil. It anchors the front of its body and brings up the rear. Tunneling. A worm makes tunnels by pushing its way into the soil and eating it. As the worm moves forward, its body coats the soil with slime. This makes the tunnel stronger, but they soon collapse. In this picture, a worm is tunneling its way through the soil. Some worms burrow deeper underground when the weather is too cold or too dry. They push down to a few feet below the surface, then coil up and go to sleep. They wake up when the weather gets better. In the blue extra information, it says that worm tunnels make airy spaces under the soil. These spaces help rainwater drain away. The soil becomes looser and finer, so it is easier for plants to grow. In our picture, this worm is sleeping through a hot, dry summer in a burrow deep underground. Mating. Worms like to mate on warm, damp nights. The two worms lie next to each other and wrap themselves together with slime. They stay close like this for several hours. After mating, the saddle on each worm makes a sticky belt of slime. The worm wriggles out of its belt and lays its eggs in it. The belt turns into a hard cocoon. It is smaller than a pea. In this picture, we have a close-up of the saddle where a worm's eggs are made. Worms have to mate with each other to make eggs. Every worm has both male and female parts to its body, so any worm it meets can be a mate. Hatching. Worms' eggs take many weeks or months to grow in the cocoon. In that time, some of the eggs will die. Sometimes just 1 or 2 worms hatch out of the cocoon. And this is a drawing of a worm's cocoon. It takes 18 months for a young worm to grow up and lay eggs of its own. If it doesn't get eaten, the worm may live in the soil for 10 years or more. In the picture, we have an adult worm with young worms. Young earthworms are about as long as a thumbnail. So if you hold up your thumb and look at the fingernail, that's about how long a baby earthworm is. They are whiter than their parents, and they have no saddles at first. Otherwise, they look just the same. Enemies. Worms have many enemies, such as hedgehogs and shrews. Both of these animals are active at night when worms come out to feed. A mole is an earthworm's greatest enemy. Moles sometimes eat 30 worms a day as they tunnel under the ground. They store extra worms in a special pantry. This is a drawing of a mole's pantry full of worms. Moles keep worms from escaping from their pantry by biting off their heads. This does not kill the worm. Its head grows again, and the worm might be able to escape. Food for birds. Many birds eat worms. Robins, blackbirds, and thrushes all visit gardens and parks. They look and listen for the tiny movements of earthworms in the ground. When a bird finds a worm, it grabs it by the tail. Worms are hard to pull out of the soil. The worm anchors itself in the ground with its bristles and pulls back hard with its powerful muscles. In this picture, we have a fight between a bird and a worm. It's just like tug-of-war. Birds hunt for worms in the spring when other food is scarce. As plants ripen in the summer and fall, birds usually leave worms alone. This next page is called Worm Wonders and just has some really cool facts about worms that may shock or surprise you. First, we have, there are over 1,800 different kinds of worms around the world. A medium-sized garden has about 20,000 earthworms. A worm's body is made up of about 250 segments. A famous scientist named Charles Darwin believed that the worm is the world's most important animal because it helps plants grow. Without worms, the soil would be wet, heavy, and hard to dig. Worms eat about 1/3 of their body weight every day. That's like a person eating 20 loaves of bread. Every crumb of soil in parks and gardens has passed through the body of a worm. Worm casts are very good for the garden. The soil in them is very fine and has valuable food from plants. Earthworm farms sell worms to gardeners to help them improve their soil. Fish like to eat juicy worms. That's why fishers use worms as bait. Worms have blood, but no heart. Alright guys, that's it for Earthworms. The rest of the book are those special pages that help you find information and understand words that we talked about earlier, such as the glossary. And then up next you have the index. Take a look for the book yourself. What will you learn? In fact, not only should you look at the book to see what you could learn, but now I have some questions. In fact, I have a lot of questions. So, what have we learned? Teachers, families at home, now would be a time in which the questions are going to go pretty quickly. So if you want to pause the video after each one, it'll stay on the screen for a few seconds, and then you can talk about that with your class, with your kids at home, whatever you need to do. They're going to go quickly, so pause wherever you feel the need to. My first question is, why can't you see earthworms on hot, sunny days? What do worms eat? What 3 animals are the enemies of earthworms? What do worms' bodies look like? Can you tell 3 facts about worm tunnels? What are some features you noticed in the book? Psst, we went over a lot of these before I read the book. Where are different places you could find earthworms? What do worms use to move? Why are worms in danger in the day and in the night? What is one thing, and I mean a cool thing, you learned about in this book? What did you take away from it? And with that, I'm all out of questions and I'm all out of time. Thanks for joining me as we read Earthworms. Bye, guys!